So welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn. Our Lunch and Learn is a series that we offer monthly from the Teaching Academy. So I wanted to start by telling you about the Teaching Academy. Our mission is to promote learning and connection in the larger New Advance Health community. With our Lunch and Learns, we are featuring innovative speakers from within New Advance Health and friends of the Teaching Academy from across the United States and across the world. Our speakers will address topics that are related to medical education and clinical education. Our monthly sessions will be held every fourth Wednesday, with some exceptions due to holidays, but you can count on us most months every fourth Wednesday to offer a session. Like Beth mentioned earlier, we are recording and we'll post the recordings on our website, which can be found at www.newvancehealth.org/ long acronym for Patricia A. Tietjen, MD, Teaching Academy. Thank you, Beth. A reminder, this is a Lunch and Learn, so please feel free, and I even encourage you to eat your lunch on screen. I'll be eating my lunch on screen. We're simulating all being together in a physical space, though we're currently all together in a virtual space. Keep your camera on and remain engaged. You will receive continuing medical education or continuing education unit credit for this session, so make sure that you log in through EADS. And if you didn't get to us through EADS, Beth has posted the link in the chat. Through EADS, you'll do your evaluation and receive your credit. Now, just one more thing before we get started, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Teaching Academy. We formed in 2021, just over a year ago. Our purpose is to create a home for the community of interprofessional clinical educators at New Advance Health. We launched our first cohort in 2021 through 2022 and have just launched our second cohort in September of this year. We currently have 17 enrolled scholars in our interprofessional cohort. Keep an eye out for applications for our subsequent cohort to go live in spring of 2023. If you're interested in becoming part of this community, or you know someone who'd be great for the Teaching Academy, please let us know. You can email us at teachingacademy@newvancehealth.org, and we will be holding office hours at hospitals across the network. We'd love to connect with you in person if you're interested. Just email that same email address and we will connect with you. So thank you for letting me introduce ourselves. I now would like to introduce Beth West, our Teaching Academy Director, who will introduce our incredible speaker.
Thank you, Robin, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our first fall session of the Lunch and Learn series. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Neil Osheroff. Neil Osheroff came to Vanderbilt in 1983 from Stanford University School of Medicine. He was a Helen Hay Whitney Foundation postdoc fellow in biochemistry. Currently, he's professor of biochemistry and medicine at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. He also holds the John G. Coniglio Chair in biochemistry. Dr. Osheroff has been a medical school course director since 1990. He's helped to lead 2 curricular revisions, was one of 4 faculty members tasked with developing and implementing the pre-clerkship phase of the medical curriculum as part of a major revision in 2013. He also currently co-leads the pre-clerkship phase, chairs the phase's teaching team, and chairs the master science teaching group. Outside of Vanderbilt, Dr. Osheroff sits on the administrative board of the AAMC Council of Faculties and Academic Societies. He's a past president of the Association of Biochemistry Educators. He's also the most recent immediate past president of the International Association of Medical Science Educators, an organization with over 2,300 members in 50 countries worldwide. Dr. Osheroff has received awards for mentoring, teaching, promoting diversity and inclusion, curricular design, and educational leadership and service. He's a fellow of the American Association for the advancement of science and the Association for Medical Education in Europe. He's also received the International Association of Medical Science Educators Distinguished Career Award for Excellence in Teaching and Educational Scholarship, and many, many more wonderful things. I just also want to say it's such a pleasure to have Dr. Osheroff here. He's been a wonderful mentor to me, and I connected with him when I first started at New Vance just over a year ago through the Academy's Collaborative. He's been a wonderful and generous mentor. We're very excited to welcome Dr. Neil Osheroff. Without further ado, kick us off. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I hope everything is going well with everybody in the Northeast today. Hopefully the weather is nice and cool, and so I'm happy to be here. What I wanted to talk to you about today is sort of the transition from going from being a teacher to being an educator. And I really want to talk a lot about what sort of the roles of the modern educator are compared to the teacher when many of us came up, certainly when I came up. And also a bit about professional identity formation of medical educators. So yeah, learning objectives describe the roles of the modern medical educator, discuss the concept of professional identity formation, compare and contrast factors that influence the formation of professional identity. And so once again, the things we're going to focus on are the roles of the modern health professions educator and professional identity formation. And please feel free to put things in the chat as we go along. If I can pick them up, I will. If not, we can talk afterwards. One thing I will point out is that I'm a basic scientist. I think probably most of the rest of you on this will be clinicians. I will talk about some things from the perspective of those of us that teach earlier in the medical school curriculum, but there are tremendous parallels that go along with what happens later in the curriculum and when you're talking to residents as well, and I'll do my best to point those out as we go along. For those of you, for all the clinicians, I'm the one, the biochemist, I'm the one that did all those things that you hated so much in the first year. So just, when you listen to me, don't trip back to the TCA cycle and have bad thoughts. All right. So the premise of the talk is that, whereas we once were, I think, medical teachers, we've become medical educators. And so to me, certainly in the earlier phases of medical school, but I think it translates throughout, the transition's really been driven by curricular revisions and integration. Certainly in the pre-clerkship phase, when you went away from siloed departmentally based courses to something that was under the guise of an educational dean, things change. So real quickly, just compare and contrast teachers versus educators. So if you can, I think I can see all the chats. Just do me a favor, when you hear the word teacher, just put some things in the chat. What words come to your mind? And I'll give you a minute, give you a few seconds anyway. When you think of the word teacher compared to educator, so guide, mentor, that's good. Experience, basic instruction, speaker, high school, there you go. Lecture, leader, great. So these are kind of some of the things we think about. I think when we think about the word teacher, we think about what I'm doing now, someone that's standing in front of a group, be it virtual or in person. Authority figure, oh my gosh, there's some people tripping back to bad times. Someone who imparts knowledge, absolutely. Support, leader, lecture, thank you. So that I think those are the things we tend to think about, that someone that stands in front of a group, that imparts knowledge, that has authoritarian perspective, potentially, someone that's in charge. And I think what we've done is we've converted over to being educators. At least that's certainly what the academy where you are is doing, and I think that's things we've done in a lot of other places. So that's really what I want to get to. So, okay, what we were in the before time, before we had integrated curricula, and once again, this goes back to some of the pre-clerkship phase, but I think I'll draw parallels. We used to have siloed discipline-based courses. So there was a biochem course, physiology, pharmacology, anatomy. But the same thing still holds for many of you now, because integration hasn't necessarily hit the clinical phase of the medical school, so that yes, you are directing a medicine clerkship or residency or surgery or anesthesiology or something like that. So very often these are still pretty siloed. You don't really know what goes on with other residency programs. You don't know what goes on with other clerkships. And so that's something that I think many of you may still be in. Eventually, The integration will hit later in medical school. It may take 10 or 20 years to start doing longitudinal clerkships, but eventually I suspect they will come. Back in the day, the majority of educational sessions were either lecture-based in my world, in your world, probably bedside-based, but not necessarily with much structure. And then the majority of assessments were either multiple choice in my world or probably observational in yours. And by observational, once again, not much structure. You looked at someone and said, yeah, they look pretty good. I think I'll give them honors. And I knew that happened at Vanderbilt an awful lot back in the day. So things have, I think, changed a lot since then. How did you get to be in the position that you're in now? In my world, you're a good lecturer, right? Someone said, great, you do this. In your world, you were skilled with patients. Students, liked you. In my case, being a biochemist, they disliked me less than they dislike other biochemists. I see a few smiles out there, a few chuckles. Generally speaking, we were enthusiastic. We were passionate about what we were doing. We enjoyed teaching. Passion is something that I don't know about residents, but medical students really treasure. One of the worst things that can happen in my world is for a student to say, Dr. Osheroff acted like he didn't even want to be here, right? And so I think the same thing in the wards, that if you're enthusiastic, your patients love you more, your trainees love you more as well. And all these things are good things. I mean, just the fact that, you're good with people, you're good with students, you enjoy doing what you're doing. These are all great things. And these are things that certainly help teaching. But there was a lot of other reasons why people were selected to do the things they're doing. In my world, you lost your funding. Hey, you don't have any grants anymore. Doesn't look like you're going to get any. I got to do something with you. Guess what? You're teaching now. And you might be a brilliant teacher. I mean, people talk about, yes, if you are a researcher, doesn't mean you're a great teacher, and that's true. But a lot of great researchers are actually great communicators. That's fine. But nonetheless, you lost your funding, so we're going to put you in this position. Maybe you needed more exposure, more teaching for promotion. And I've had that happen. And sometimes those people that they give you are terrible teachers. It's your turn to run the course. Someone had it for 3 years and they're not doing it anymore. It's your turn, or we got no one else to do it, which is, I think, what a lot of my colleagues hear when someone leaves their clerkship position and they say, well, it's going to be you. In general, these can be less than positive impact on student learning or trainee learning. The other thing from a faculty perspective that I think is maybe even more devastating is that because, okay, if Beth can't do it anymore, Neil's going to do it. I think a lot of chairs and division directors tend to view teachers as being interchangeable, right? Anyone can do it. And I think this is where the knock comes, where a lot of people feel like they're treated like second-class citizens. Because if anyone can do what you're doing, then you're not really very valued. So I think this has really been a problem in terms of faculty identity formation and also for students. Once again, if someone's put in a position they don't want to be in, if they're not particularly good at it, chairs have other responsibilities and they need to take care of their people and make sure they're doing certain things. But if you're a course director, if one of you are, running the medicine clerkship, you know who the people you want to have your students with, and you know who you want to have your house staff with, your residents, and you know who you don't want to. When your chair or division director says, oh no, I think Neil will be a perfect preceptor for this group, you cringe and you go and do it anyway. So these are problems. So what have been the ramifications of sort of the modern integrated curriculum? And once again, with my lens in the pre-clerkship, but I think it goes for all of us, less time to teach. RVUs are pushing all of you. We understand that. On the one hand, they say, oh, take time with the students and train them. The other hand, but by the way, if you don't make your quotas, bad things happen. In my world, we're cutting down on the time when we're doing the basic sciences. It's forced us to change how we teach and assess. We have to go more modern assessment strategies. The way we teach is different now. It's less what I'm doing with you right now. It's more facilitation. It's always good. You'll always hear people come and talk to you about how active learning is much better, how team-based learning or problem-based learning is vastly better than what I'm doing right now. But they always manage to give you this in a lecture, right? So I know you're talking about the Northeast GEA is going to be at Vermont. They will happily come and tell you how they've gotten rid of all lectures that are bad and evil at their medical school. But when they're delivering that information to you, they're giving it to you in a lecture. So go figure. We've all had to work in teams. It used to be the physician kind of ruled and people were below them. Not anymore. It's really team-based, and especially in the learning environment. And that was a big shakeup for certainly those of us that have taught in the pre-clerkship phase. All of a sudden, I at that point been in charge of my biochem course for 15 years. Someone had been in charge of a histology course for 7 or 8 years. Someone had been doing things in genetics. They throw you in a room together and say, put together a course when you're not sure who's running it anymore and what your jobs are. That was a big shock for all of us. Centralized administration. If you're no longer under the guise of your department, my job when I ran the biochem course was to make it so my chair never had to deal with it, period. Once it was no longer a biochemistry course, it changed. Now it's under the auspices of the Office of Teaching and Learning, or the Senior Associate Dean for Undergraduate Medical Education. It's changed a lot of things. For one thing, as I like to tell people, that I had one job in the biochemistry department no one else wanted. So on the one hand, that gave me a lot of love in the department, because there were times when I was being recruited away from Vanderbilt, and invariably there'd be a line outside my chair's office saying, if Neil leaves, I'm not doing this. So that was part of the reason I think they always wanted to keep me. And the last thing is that we've had to be advocates for the discipline. In days of old, it was the chairs, division directors, and now it's really the people in the street. So those of us that are in charge of courses, there's no such thing as a biochemistry course anymore, right? It's part of things with my course. It's called Human Blueprint and Architecture. It used to be called Molecular Foundations of Medicine. You'll find a lot of names for these courses, but you don't hear them called biochemistry anymore. So the chairs aren't the ones that are advocating for this anymore. It has to be people that are well-trained and good educators. So along with these integrated curricula, certainly came new responsibilities and relationships with the department and the university. Our stock in our departments, I recognize this right away, within 2 years plummeted, because once again, my chair didn't have to worry about this course anymore. Once that happened, it wasn't a big deal. The course did well or didn't do well, it wasn't on his radar screen anymore. On the other hand, the university finally figured out the really people that were educating their students. So it became, in theory, much more important to the university. And hopefully universities recognize that. Vastly larger skill set required for medical educators than in the past. Oh my goodness. When I came up, if you could lecture, right? You could use slides. I remember when the big innovation was going to PowerPoint. So that was about the only skill set you needed, that, and you knew how not to antagonize the medical students. Now, the amount of things you need to know as an educator, that's why you have an academy now. It's a vastly larger skill set, much more appropriate skill set. We're doing a much better job, I think, of educating our learners. But once again, it's much harder, so that, and it takes much more time, so that I'm sort of a dinosaur in my field, because I still run a full research laboratory in addition to all the medical education I do. For those of you that are still doing a lot of clinical work while you're doing all that work with your medical students, you recognize how much time and effort you have to put into both skill sets. So I think it's sort of more important than ever to define the essential roles of the modern health profession as educator, and define who we are as educators compared to teachers. And yeah, for those of you that are of a certain age, you'll recognize the album cover. When I tell youngsters that when they look at this and they have no idea who the Who are, I say the theme for CSI shows, and they look at me and say, I have no idea what the CSI shows are, because those have been off the air for a while. But just think of the theme in the back, and we want to talk about who we are. Now, there's a bunches of people that are telling us who we are, and that they're all good. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We have things like the AAMC, the equivalent of this are the CanMeds in Canada. People like Ronald Hardin have written books on this. Ronald was now stepped down as the executive secretary of the Association for Medical Education in Europe, or AME. Academies are doing this. This is the Academy of Medical Educators, which is a UK-based group that sets standards worldwide. So there's a lot of things that have come up. So none of us are reinventing the wheel. We're kind of putting things together a little bit differently. And once again, if you want to comment any of this, that's fine. Before, to some extent, a few of these things you had listed up there, but most of the things you had listed for teacher had things like instruction, instructor, someone who imparts knowledge, authority figure, support. And those would come under here. Really, I think when I think about teachers, I think about information providers. In addition to that, now we also have to be information curators, because it turned out somewhere in, I think, the 50s, they looked up and they decided that medical knowledge in the world was doubling once every 52 years. So if you got your medical degree somewhere in the early 50s, basically everything they taught you in med school would cover most of your career. By the time that hit the 80s, it was down, or 70s was down to 7 years, the 80s down to 3 years. And at some point they made a projection way into the future in that year 2020. And the projection was that medical knowledge was going to double in the world every 72 days. So I run a 6-week block. By the time my block is done, medical knowledge in the world has already doubled. So unfortunately, we can't teach everything to the med students that they need to know anymore. Same thing with your residents. Same thing for all of you. You're constantly evolving. Our students don't watch television anymore, but if they did, which I think many of you are of a certain age where you still watch television, every night you're inundated with ads for new drugs, right? That are constantly changing the way we're thinking about things. So we have to be able to not only teach our trainees, but we also have to be able to teach them how to teach themselves and how to find information. As I tell people, if the only thing you needed to do to be a physician was to hopefully be smart and know how to look things up, I could have my clinics on Wednesdays. But clinicians being smart won't let a biochemist anywhere near patients. So the fact is that physicians and need to know something. There's always a debate about what. So they're still acting as a teacher, but now there's a lot more facilitation that goes on as well. We're now assessors also, because the days of simply going to a question bank or just pulling out multiple choice questions are behind us. We have to know some things about psychometrics. We have to know some things about by serials. We have to know things. I mean, people go ash when I tell them that we believe in essay exams to some extent at Vanderbilt. So after my course was done, I had the pleasure of grading 2,200 essays. Yeah, a few people jolted their heads. If you talk to a school, we have a relatively small class. Ours is only 96. It's almost boutique by today's standards. If you talk to people in St. George's in Grenada, where they have 2 classes a year, the fall class is 800 students, and the spring class is a mere 600 students. If you use the word essay examination, they go ashen very quickly. We are mentors and coaches now. They're slightly different, but we certainly are shepherding our trainees through. And I can tell you, for those of you that are dealing with med students, they're becoming much more fragile, I think, than they've been in the past, coming out of COVID. As we make the transition to Gen Zs, we're the ones that see them first, and we're going to have to work a little harder. So there's a lot of things that go into the mentoring and coaching. The other thing that becomes so important now is being a curriculum designer or implementer. When I took over the biochemistry course, I made some changes, but no real major overhauls. Now we're putting together courses de novo. And in Vanderbilt, we're putting together courses in the 3rd and 4th years that are acting internships, that are advanced electives, integrated science courses. And these are things that really now have to have people that can really design a curriculum, even in the clinical years. Educational leadership, I think, is incredibly important right now, because we have to have banner bearers. The other thing is that there's so much more opportunity. I like to throw out a quote from Sun Tzu, The Art of War, which goes, in the midst of chaos, there's also opportunity. Curricular revision is incredibly chaotic. And I think that in order to survive and do well, you need to be able to control your own environment. And the only way to do that is take leadership roles. And the last thing is scholarship, because back in the day, the notion of writing papers about what you're doing, go to medical education meetings, imparting knowledge, talking with other people, I think was something that was relatively foreign. And now it's incredibly common. I would encourage all of you that are in the academy or thinking about going to your academy to think about going to various meetings. You'll learn a tremendous amount. You'll also find you have a wonderful community out there, people to talk with. The other thing to understand is, when it comes time for things like promotions, you need to have letters, usually from outside your institution. And the problem is, if the only thing you do is just meet with your medical students in your Department of Medicine or surgery or anesthesiology, whatever, you don't ever have the opportunity to meet these people. So I think it's a phenomenal idea to go out there and see what's happening in the rest of the world, but also there are phenomenally nice people you get to meet and get to work with the whole time. Beth and I connected actually virtually, right, through the Academy's collaborative. But you make friends all over the world, and that's really a great thing. So what I want to talk to you about is a project that was just done under the auspices of the International Association of Medical Science Educators about professional identity formation, in this case of biomedical scientists and their pathways in the health science education. But I'll also point out that there are tremendous parallels with clinicians, and I think you'll find things that I'm talking about hopefully will sound familiar to many of you. And the first time we presented this was actually in big time was at the AMI meeting that was just held in Lyon. Yet another reason to go to medical education, because you may have the opportunity to present your work in Lyon, France, compared to doing it online here in a wonderful forum, but still the wine is better in France than it is online. We had, I think, 16 people involved. It was 7 U.S. allopathic medical schools that range from large state schools to more boutique schools, from R1 research-oriented institutions to ones that were primarily teaching, public, private, and even one that's a public-private partnership. So it covered a lot of ground. There have been a number of studies in professional identity formation in medicine. So you hear all the time about professional identity in your learners. And when you talk about professional identity, the line here from this paper was that's a representative self achieved in stages over time during which the characteristics, values, and norms of the medical profession are internalized, resulting in an individual thinking, acting, and feeling like a physician. And that's true, but what we're going to talk about now are the people that are actually educating them. And I will point out before I get into the basic sciences, this is one that came out. Barrett Fromm was one of the people on this, who's very much involved in the Academy's collaborative. And this was a paper that came out in Academic Medicine a little over a year ago, looking at the influences on characteristics of professional identity formation of clinical educators. And what they found, themes that they highlighted, were that things that are very important to people's identity were the fact they had role models and mentors. They had an affinity or aptitude for teaching and education. They enjoyed it. They say specific facilitators for entry into a career in medical education. Sometimes these are planned. More often than not, they're sporadic. And there's a lot of serendipity involved for most of us having gotten there. There's been an evolution from when you were a layperson. But I think the other things they're pointing out, important to formalize training programs like the one you're at right now. And the other thing I think is incredibly important is having a supportive academic community. And that's one of the things that academies are really important for. And we'll talk more about that. So now if we look at basic sciences, there have been very few studies for basic science medical educators through over the years. They've really focused on clinical educators. And basic science educators, we're the ones that tormented you guys as you were coming along. Microscopic things to anatomy, molecular sciences. We have a big role in educating people. I think we do it differently now. If you want to hear more about that, I think those of us that are hopefully are doing a good job of it no longer see the split between basic sciences and clinical sciences. To be honest, I don't like that anymore. I see what we're doing is providing the foundation for medical practice, so that when you have trainees, when you're explaining things to them, whether you think about it or not, you're using a lot of your basic science knowledge. And these are really the things that, okay, we have a diabetic patient, how are we going to manage them? This goes back to all those basic sciences, but we just need to stop thinking about them as being separate from what you're doing, which I think for years they were. 2 years basic sciences, brick wall, and then now you get to a real doctor now that you've been tormented for long enough. And we never taught in a way that you could carry on to the wards as easily. So I think we've done a lot in the pre-clerkship phases now, and I think we're doing a much better job. Hopefully that's making you're having an easier time with your learners. So what we want to do is explore the pathways into the profession. and factors influencing professional identity formation in basic science faculty who saw themselves as medical educators. And this was a mixed method, qualitative, descriptive study. We had 58 hour-long interviews from medical educators, basic science medical educators from 7 allopathic U.S. medical schools. And our inclusion criteria were they had to be full-time faculty members, a PhD in a foundational or basic science discipline, and at least 10% of effort in medical education. We purposely did not take MD PhDs because we wanted to try to keep this more focused on basic science professional identity rather than the clinical one, because so much work gets done with clinicians as they're growing up into the field. And like I said, in-depth individual interviews, thematic analysis of interview data. Right now, we're just writing the papers up now. So the first thing is really the pathways into medical science education. And a number of things came up. The first and foremost, it was for most of us, it was serendipity. I'll just talk a little bit about my pathway at the very end, but in my generation, no one set out, unless you were an anatomist, no one set out to say, I'm going to get my PhD, then go teach medical students. It just wasn't a thing. We all got there by some other route. Generally speaking, with zero training whatsoever. So formal training now becomes very important. There are a number of people coming out now that say, this is what I want to do. I really want to do education. I want to do it with medical students or other health professions. The formal training, I think, becomes really a big deal. Once again, I don't know how you guys felt the first time they said, hey, we want some students around with you today. And did anyone sit there and say, all right, here's how you deal with students, here's how you work in a group? No, it's all I see some laughing. It was all osmosis. You've been there before. It's like, mom's driven you to soccer practice for the last 2 years. You got your license. Of course, you know how to get there now, right? And the answer is you never paid any attention to it before. In my day, gosh, I don't think there was any formal training. Go give a lecture, right? That was about it. Same thing with running a lab. Same thing for you. They taught you how to deal with patients. They didn't teach you how to run a practice, right? It was expected you would know these. We're much better about being intentional about these now. Mentors play a huge role, both good and bad, in bringing people into the profession. Sometimes they were supportive. Sometimes they weren't. And you had to overcome that. You got to overcoming obstacles. I think as you're making transitions into becoming more of an educator, there are barriers. We'll talk about those in just a minute, but there are things you have to overcome as well. And fundamentally, there's also an attraction to teaching. Hopefully, all of you enjoy what you're doing. If you don't, you should be doing something else, to be honest, because trainees can feel that. Like I said, when you're there, it's like, oh God, I've got to deal with the damn students now. Okay, bring them on. It doesn't make for a good interaction. So I suspect that all of you really enjoy the work dealing with residents or fellows or students. It's a joy and it's a pleasure. Also, if you work with people that are a lot younger than you all the time, it's a lot more fun than dealing with old people like me. I don't want to spend my life dealing with guys my age. The things they talk about are not nearly as much fun as youngsters do. Other things about sort of, if that was the rules in, there are a lot of things that really affect identity. And these, once again, these were done for basic sciences, but I think they also go right back to many of them to clinicians. In terms of the roles you play, there's identity conflict. There's also identity evolution. For many of my colleagues, it was giving up your laboratory. And is that something, and you've got this identity as a basic scientist and as a researcher, and an identity as an educator, and they're in conflict a lot of the times. For many of you, I think as you are doing more education, you're certainly still seeing patients, but you're doing less of it. And especially if you go higher up, the people with deanships at some point sort of give up all or most of their practice, and there's a lot of conflict when they do that. So I think there are tremendous parallels there. Context, interpersonal, structural things. Mentors, good mentors matter to a lot of people. When I was at Stanford, there was someone that did his PhD at Harvard, was working in a lab for someone that should have won a Nobel Prize. At one point didn't. He had Science Cell and Nature papers, and he, unbeknownst to anyone else, had gone and interviewed because he wanted to go teach. And he got a job at Bethel College, which is a small college in St. Paul, Minnesota. When his advisor and people in the lab found out, basically they stopped talking to him. They wrote him off. He wasn't interesting anymore, and he wasn't obviously going to be anyone important. Unfortunately, he passed away at a relatively early age of cancer, but not before he was named the Howard Hughes undergraduate professor in the entire state of Minnesota, right? So mentors can matter. Community of practice, I think, is incredibly important. It really emphasizes, really helps you. I know that when I started doing more education work, as I tell people, I had the great pleasure this year of teaching my 40th class of medical students. I've been a course director, block director here for the last 34 years, I guess. It's my 34th year doing that. I ran the biochemistry course here for 17 years. During that period of time, I learned absolutely nothing about teaching. It wasn't until we started doing curricular integration, I started looking more about education, that I really started to become much more involved in it. The first time I ever felt really at home was when I went to a Southern Group in Educational Affairs meeting back in the day. It was more clinically based. There was a lot of med-ed talk, which I did not understand at the time, and I think people like to throw big words around to make them feel good, which was even worse. It was the first time they had a meeting of biochemistry educators. My chair said, "Oh, there's this meeting we're putting together. You ought to go to it." As I tell people, he didn't offer to pay, but he told me how to go to it. And that was the first time I ever felt like I had people. And so I think a community of practice is incredibly important. Having your community there as part of your academy is important. Going out, going to meetings, things like that, I think becomes very important. For many of my colleagues, the fact that it was what those things that helped, things that hurt, they were quote unquote not an MD. So there was a wonderful humorist named George Goebbels back in the day, and he always talked about he felt like a pair of brown shoes at a formal occasion. That's the way PhDs often feel like in medical schools. But the same thing goes for you. I have a friend that ran the surgery clerkship. I thought that was a really important position. I asked her about it one day. She says, "No, it's not important, Neil. It just means the other surgeons look at me like I'm only a part-time surgeon now." So I think even for many of you, you still face some of these barriers that, okay, you are an MD, but you're not a full-time clinician anymore because you're doing so much work with trainees. For PhDs also, you're not a researcher. And one of the things that was most devastating that we picked up with our study was that the very people who should be supporting you, your fellow PhDs, very often no longer looked at you as a researcher. They no longer looked at you as a scientist. So that's pretty devastating. If you have your clinical department that no longer looks at you as being a real surgeon anymore because you're dealing with students too much. So those kind of things were problematic. And also at many institutions, there's not a defined pathway to promotion for educators. Other things that happened that really helped early teaching experiences. So if you did some teaching, you liked it. Having a passion for teaching was, of course, a wonderful thing. And many people went into teaching because they just didn't like research. That doesn't mean it's a bad reason. It's not an inherently good one. You know, if you say, well, I'm a surgeon and I really don't like doing surgery, so I'm going to do anatomy instead, same kind of a deal. That hopefully you're drawn to things rather than being pushed away from others. So for us, basic scientists, the professional identity formation is really, I think, kind of unique. The roles and identity description are really varied and dynamic for those of us in this part. I think as a group, we determined that basic science educators are pretty self-determined, highly motivated, and are lifelong learners. I think the same can be said for people in the clinical space. There was a real interesting mix of supportive and challenging influences. And to a greater or lesser extent, which was also sad, most basic science educators that we talked to, when they had supportive experiences, they usually refer to them as being lucky. And rather than something that should be the norm, it was like, I was so fortunate because I had people that would support me in this. And I think that's sort of a sad commentary. There was a tremendous amount of serendipity, a lot of mentoring, a lot of on-the-job training as the most common pathways. Once again, nowadays, when we see people coming right out of graduate school or postdocs and they want to go into education, there are pathways now. There are people that can train them. In my day, it was like, there's a lecture hall, go to work. I think there's a real need for educational training programs. And once again, the Academy, what they're doing, I think is great. Communities of practice are so important. They really strengthen, support the career pathways. When you look around, if you're seeing a lot, if you're doing a lot of work with trainees, it may well be that other people in your division don't quite see you the same way anymore. They don't see you as one of the guys. You're not doing surgery as much. You're not seeing as many patients. I think it's nice to have people that understand what you're going through. That, if you say, well, I had this problem with my students today, and someone else says, well, why bother? That's not the response you're looking for. So you want people to understand what you're going through, but also can help you with it. And I really think that there are structural changes and support we need to do at an institutional level to help recognize value and promote, and have people that are doing education really feel like they belong. I'm very fortunate at Vanderbilt, once again, one of those lucky things, because I think we have a great administration that really recognizes this. There are pathways for promotion on the educator tracks. In fact, it's the biggest track we have among our clinicians is clinician educator. What they consider clinician educator doesn't necessarily mean they have to do a lot of education, but nonetheless, I think that being valued is really important, having pathways to promotion. As an interesting example, UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, is probably considered the leading school of all medical schools in the country for curricular revision. The concept, David Irby is there. They have a phenomenal academy, but they have no educator track. So when you hear people like David Irby are a professor there, internally he's an adjunct professor. So if you're considered one of the most important people in the U.S. in terms of curricular revision, and you're in school, you're only considered an adjunct, that's never a good thing. I will point out that while we were doing this, there was another study that was done actually in Indonesia by Yvonne Steiner, using the Forrest-Schlossberg framework, looking at professional identity formation of basic science teachers in medical education. And I'll point out they came up with some things that were very congruent with what we had. He said it's important to address the professional identity formation of basic science teachers given their dynamic roles. Looking through the lens of the Forrest framework, professional identity formation is indeed a transition process. Okay, it's structured, stepwise faculty development program, including mentorship, reflective practice, and community of practice designed to foster basic science teachers' identities should be created, taking into consideration the diverse factors influencing the professional identity formation of basic science teachers. But I think you can apply the exact same thing to what most of you are. Getting to where you are now is an evolutionary process. A community of practice helps more than I can tell you. And I think that you need things to strengthen viewing who you are. I'll point out that my journey as a medical educator was as circuitous as anyone else's. Tremendous amount of serendipity that brought me where I am, that really goes back to my first weeks on faculty at Vanderbilt. Now we never make any new faculty teach, but back in those days, that's what you were there for. So the good old boys didn't have to teach anymore. And my chair came into me, put his arm on my shoulder and said, "Kid, I think it'd be great for you to teach the medical students a little bit, have them get to know who you are, have the administration get to know who you are." And I remember he looked at me and went like, "Now, if you're too busy, just tell me, and you don't have to do this at all." And I remember looking at it, just me and my chair in my lab, no one else. And I was thinking, I really don't want to do this, but it was pretty hard to look in an empty lab and tell my chair I was so busy that I couldn't do any teaching. And very much what I do goes back to that one moment in time. I had mentors along the way. Some were phenomenal, some were terrible. But the terrible ones made me become really independent and things like that. I'd never have to worry about feeling sort of second class because I already have my identity as a researcher. So I never felt what some of my colleagues did. I definitely had attraction to teaching and more recently leadership. It turns out that I haven't had that many opportunities to do leadership at Vanderbilt in the science realm, but education just opened up some doors. So I've been having a ball with that. That we can talk about, but having the opportunity to lead the International Association of Medical Science Educators through the pandemic was really one of the high points of certainly my academic career. some formal training. The early work went back to none. It's really when we started doing curricular revision, we started doing formal training. And the community practice, I can't emphasize enough. I think it's so important just to have people that can understand you, that you can work with and feel at home with. So summary, okay. Like I said, I want to leave some time for question and answers. Closing advice to everybody. Absorb all the information you can that's going to make you a better educator. I think you'll be happier. Like I said, your academy is playing such an important role. You'll be amazed if you do this routinely, when you look back on yourself 5 years ago, how different you are. You may not see it. It's incremental steps, but they matter. Seek out help from others. Form networks. Consider new ideas. Be creative. Don't be afraid of trying novel approaches. As long as you're genuine with it, it'll probably work out okay. Networks become incredibly important. Just the opportunity to interact with other people. And once again, when you come up for things like promotion, they want to have letters from outside your institution. It's really hard to have those letters if no one in the world knows who you are. So you have the opportunity to network and do some things with people all over the world. And I have had the opportunity and the great pleasure of giving medical education talks in every continent except for Antarctica. And the day that they decide to have a medical school in Antarctica, you better believe I will find a way down there. So I think it's critical to work with both your basic science and your clinical colleagues to get the best outcomes. If you have the opportunity, we don't bite. We used to, we don't anymore. But I think it's really important just to understand how your students and people have been trained and figure out ways to help people like me train the students better. And for people like you to understand how to impart some of the underlying mechanistic basis for disease to them better. Burnout does not come from working really hard. And I know that as clinicians, my friends that are clinicians, I think researchers work really hard. Clinicians are getting slammed during the pandemic, and I know how hard you guys are working. It turns out hard work doesn't do it. It's really not controlling your own environment. It's when you come in, you can't control the shifts, you're doing things right, and you find out you've got no nursing staff that day, and you have to improvise. All these things that the university keeps telling you, you're doing wonderfully, we really appreciate it. And by the way, you have to do twice as much now. The only way you can control your environment is for you to maybe seek some leadership roles. So I think that's just important. I think it's important to be scholarly, read the literature, disseminate your ideas and successes, because if you come up with a great idea, it's good for other people too. So help other people. Number 6 thing is important, have fun. Gosh, I mean, if you're having fun, your trainees, your coworkers will really appreciate it. Your patients will appreciate it. If you're upbeat and you're enjoying it and you're smiling with your patients, they walk away happier. If you're glum and dour, it never makes for good interactions. And the other thing I think is so important is identify 1 or 2 educational organizations that you can call home and you can grow with. I think these organizations are critical for you, helping you develop and maintain your professional network and identity. What you're in right now, the academy, I think is a great one. But look outside. If you don't normally go to meetings, if you go to meetings, the first time you go to a meeting, we don't know anybody, it's scary. You sit there, you feel awkward. You meet a few people. If you go back to that same meeting the next year, you say, hey, Beth, we met, remember, we started talking. By the time you're there, your 3rd time, you got people, right? And all of a sudden, Beth and I are saying, all right, we're going to get together at the meeting. We're going to have dinner this night. We're going to do these things. And so it takes a little while to break in. But once you do that, I think it becomes really important. And it's so nice to have people who understand you and respect you for what you do and can help you. And you, in turn, can do the same for them. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. I'm happy to have discussion. Feel free to tell me how much you hated learning the TCA cycle. That's okay. We don't teach it that way anymore for your older people. And, like I said, either you can talk to me through the chat or just unmute yourself, whatever Beth prefers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Osheroff. And friends, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
I'd like to jump in if that's okay. Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated that. My question is, how do you balance mentoring, coaching, and giving constructive feedback to the new generation of medical students, or the new generation of, you mentioned fragility as something that.
Yeah. It's hard. I think you balance it. I think you kind of get an idea of what you think are best. I think you need to be true to yourself, but also things are evolving constantly. Our new generation that I've seen are they're nervous, they're anxious, they are very attuned to social issues, but by the same token, they're not necessarily attuned to the person next to them. So we had a student here that used the term third world country a couple of years ago, which is no longer politically correct. It's now under resource countries or low and middle income countries. But it was a teaching moment. Instead of teaching, the student next to him took their head off. So, remind me of a song from Hair. If you remember the rock opera, the first of the big ones, where it says, do you only care about the bleeding flowers? What about a needing friend? And so we have students that care about the bleeding flowers. They care about all the social causes. They don't necessarily care about you sitting next to them. So I think it's like anything else. You just start working with them. You do with things you think are important. I mean, I did get the gumption at a meeting once to say, when it was a session on faculty resilience. And I did say that I thought that the biggest impediment to faculty wellness was student wellness. Because if students aren't doing well, we put so much time and effort into it, and we tend to ignore ourselves, right? Student didn't do well, you're writing new exams, you got to go proctor, and you got to work with them. So I think it's like anything else. I have a geneticist in my course. She came to us directly out of her fellowship, literally the week after the med student showed up. She was as close and near peer as we could have possibly had. And when she got in front of the student, she was, "What's wrong with these students today? We were never like that." I mean, she'd been in med school like 5 years earlier, right? So we're always going to do that. Every generation will do that. I think you just do it, you just word. I mean, the problem is it takes time, but if you enjoy what you're doing. And the other thing I'll point out is that if I give a great lecture that's wonderful, and you feel good about yourself, the days that you truly remember, I remember the days I find you crying in the hall, that you didn't do well on a quiz, and you're convinced that the dean of the School of Medicine's going to write you an email telling you're dismissed in week 3 of medical school, and I've had students do that. And when you kind of talk them off the ledge and you help them to develop the person they are, those are the days you feel like you actually did something. And I know you constantly have those kind of interactions with patients. The day you have that aha moment of a patient or one of your trainees. So I think you just do the best you can. I mean, people ask, how do I run a lab and do the medical education stuff that I do? And I'm a bad example. I don't sleep very much. I'm not the best role model in that regard. But if you do what you love, then you enjoy it. Other things. Okay, these are the kind of stare backs that you get when you're in front of a class, right? That you guys complain about when you say, I go, isn't this great? And the students just sit there and look at you, right? So that's what I'm getting, those vibes right now. So
Dr. Osheroff, hi, thank you for your talk. You've goaded me into action. Nice going.
Fair enough.
And I'm imagining you're going to get a letter from PU soon, which is Penguin University, because there will be a school in Antarctica.
I'm looking forward to that. I'm hoping so.
So 2 questions. One speculative, I guess. So in the last certainly 5 years, 10 years, the very committed shift to active learning has become part of our fiber. Most of the people, or many of the people on the screen, are faculty at University of Vermont. Although we're not in the foundations the first 2 years, we try to maintain the spirit of active learning. And one of the charming things about active learning, especially team-based learning, is students are encouraged or even forced to teach each other.
Yeah.
Do you imagine that's going to be willy-nilly or passively some form of faculty development, so that they're going to learn lessons about how to communicate better? You think it will affect the percent that go on to become medical educators?
It certainly helps them communicate better. Whether you get more medical educators, I bet I hope we do. We also at Vanderbilt, we do some TBLs. We also do a lot of case-based learning, which is essentially problem-based learning. And we have sort of a 3-legged stool, because in addition to integrating basic sciences with clinical medicine in those sessions, we also do competencies now. So at the same time, we are working with the students in their professionalism, interpersonal skills, communication skills, things like that. So I think active learning is good. Now, Vermont, for those of you there, you know that the administration feels that lectures are bad and evil, and you've gone lecture free. Of course, if Katie Huggett's on here, she can correct me. But I have heard they have interactive large group sessions, which sound a lot like my lectures. And of course, anytime you go anywhere and they tell you about how bad and evil lectures are and how much better active learning is, they always tell you in the form of a lecture. I'll just point that out. But I think that active learning is a great thing, and it really helps the students to get out of their shells. It gets them into teams earlier because they're going to be in teams later on. So I think it's great. If it produces more medical educators, I think it'd be wonderful. I don't know whether we'll want. We'll just have to wait and see on that. You have one more question? Or
Yeah, and this is meant to be maybe a little challenging or even provocative, but the world of medical education has been really champions innovation and at best, and disruption at best or worst. And in medicine, we learn lessons clinically, in surgery maybe particularly, that standardization improves outcomes. If you walk into an OR and everything is the same in hospital A, B, C, and D, fewer mistakes are made, the outcomes are better. We produce a national crop of physicians, and someone does their undergrad, their pre-med at Name University, med school at Vanderbilt. They do their residency somewhere else, third place for their fellowship. And the public expects every physician is well trained. And have we overemphasized, innovation to the point where we've lost a chance to make, a really good product and within that find a way to create innovation? Because every med school turns out to be a small shop. And, the kind of funny thing you hear at every AAMC meeting and every, Northeast group or Southeast group meeting is, if you've seen one med school, you've seen one med school. That's a little upsetting.
Okay, first we need to maintain standards. So I agree with you in that. Innovations are good. I think, we're trying to come up with best practices. So over the years, med schools do things differently, but we are coming up with best practices, more active learning, more competencies based and things like that. We also need to realize that our learners learn differently. Some love to sit in the lecture and learn that way. Some really prefer the small groups. So I appreciate what you're saying about standardization. I worry about that in the educational level, but I agree with you totally that at some point things are going to start converging again, right? It may be that you will use team-based learning, I'll use problem-based learning, someone else will use something else, but the ideas that we need to have active learning, that we need to talk about, for me, the sciences differently than we used to, right? For people on the wards, they need to also be able to convey the mechanism which they weren't doing for a long time. At least that was not the appearance that people like me had. That okay, this is the treatment I'm using, and this is why I'm using it. So let's go back and review these things. So I think that there are certain things that will be helpful. I agree with you, though, that if every med student, in other words, you can't have med schools that think that, okay, we don't really specialize in the heart here, so we're not going to talk about cardiology at all. Those are the kind of things that I think are really, really bad ideas. But I think that as long as you're covering the basics and you're doing things, I think innovation's okay, because I think that different people learn differently, and they're going to find the medical school that hopefully works the best for them. But I do appreciate the point that, if you go into every OR and it looks the same as the last one you've been in, as long as it's well done. The problem is finding the world's best OR, because I think you'd also agree that if you had a mediocre OR that everyone modeled off of, that would make everyone worse.
But just to follow up, the organ that could do that is really the LCME, and we don't share data in a way that really lets us, I think, do a deep dive into best practice. Yeah,
and also when you site visit by the LCME, every site visit team is different. some really like innovation, some like it less. Some, so I hear from some schools that say, oh, we're so worried, and gosh, we breezed through ours. Other schools that are phenomenal and their leaders got just nitpicked to death. So I agree with you. I think those are things, I think we can all do things better. So, we'll see how it goes.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. I know Dr. Osheroff has another commitment right at 1 p.m. So unfortunately, I need to just stop our conversation here. But thank you for beginning such a wonderful conversation. I know it'll continue amongst this community of educators. Dr. Osheroff, thank you also for being such an incredible mentor to Beth. She has been a huge force for good in this teaching academy, and I know she's learned so much from you, so thank you.
And if anyone, please feel free to email me, neil.osheroff@vanderbilt.edu, or Beth can give you my email address if you want to continue the conversation, and I'm happy to talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And before we leave, I do want to get you all of our attendees excited and interested about our next Lunch and Learn session. Next month, October 26th, we feature our own Mary Shaw. She's an inaugural scholar of the Teaching Academy, medical librarian and archivist at Norwalk Hospital. She will discuss finding the evidence. Mary, as I said, is an inaugural scholar of the Teaching Academy. She's signed on for an optional year 2 to continue her academic scholarship in support of education at New Vance Health. She recently completed a certificate in diversity, equity, and inclusion from Cornell University. I know you're going to love hearing from her, so join us in October.
Thank you. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you so much. Bye.